Adelante.
Bueno, bienvenidos. Gracias por participar, por reunirse para escuchar nuestra conversación sobre un libro de reciente publicación sobre culturas estratégicas, que procederemos luego a explicar ese concepto y la aplicación que el libro hace a casos de estudio, a situaciones en América Latina. Mi nombre es Nicolás Terradas. Yo soy actualmente profesor modalidad Tenure Track aquí en la PUC, en el Departamento de Ciencias Sociales, en la especialidad de Relaciones Internacionales. Y nos acompañan no todos los autores y coeditores. Lamentablemente hubo algunos colegas que no pudieron participar hoy, pero tenemos sí a uno de mis coeditores, a Diezo Zambrano, que nos acompaña desde España. Diego es un investigador y ha participado como analista también en Paradigm, en una empresa en España e Inglaterra. Es un colega nuestro, hemos estudiado nuestros doctorados juntos, parte de dónde surgió este proyecto, que luego hablaremos de eso. Y su investigación generalmente se enfoca en temas de política, política económica internacional, o economía política internacional y en particular asuntos de economía global y cómo moldean las relaciones en América Latina entre política y economía. Ha publicado artículos sobre teoría de la dependencia, por ejemplo, y su tesis doctoral también trabaja un tema central de lo que luego nos va a hablar, que fue su contribución en capítulo al libro. También nos acompaña desde Turquía, desde Ankara, Onur Erpul. Em, Onur es un fellow, un postdoctoral fellow en el Centro de Política Exterior y Estudios de Paz en Ishan Doramashi Peace Foundation en Ankara, en Turquía. Ha sido hasta muy recientemente instructor adjunto en el Departamento de Relaciones Internacionales en la Universidad Técnica de Medio Oriente, METU, más conocida, en Ankara, Turquía, una muy buena institución, y es actualmente instructor en la Universidad de Bilkent, también en Ankara. Y sus intereses son similares a los míos, enfocados en temas de teoría de relaciones internacionales y política exterior. Eh, Luego nos acompaña también un tocayo, como diríamos en Argentina, Nicolás Beckmann, alemán, actualmente profesor, recientemente incorporado al departamento como profesor asistente, ¿verdad? En el departamento de ciencia política en la Universidad de los Andes, en Colombia. Nicolás Beckmann es un experto en temas de políticas de droga y narcotráfico. Y por supuesto, teorías de RI y asuntos de las RI globales o Global IR, como se lo llama, al igual que Onur, que también ha trabajado esos temas. Y los tres que hemos presentado, y yo como cuarto, tenemos un doctorado en Relaciones Internacionales en la Universidad Internacional de la Florida, en FIU, en donde hicimos o maestría y doctorado, o nuestros doctorados, y quien en este momento la idea era que se sumara, pero está teniendo problemas de conectividad, fue nuestro mentor del doctorado, Félix Martín, que es profesor asistente en el Departamento de Relaciones Internacionales en esa universidad, la Internacional de la Florida, y fue no solo mentor de nuestros doctorados, también fue un gran componente en nuestro grupo humano, el grupo de colegas que hemos creado, y este es un proyecto de esa interacción, tanto académica como personal, que hemos forjado en esos años en Miami. Em, si me permiten, voy a hacer una aclaración. Todos hablamos inglés, los panelistas, pero solo Onur quien nos acompaña no habla español. Entonces, la idea originalmente era que el panel, este conversatorio, sea un conversatorio bilingüe. Eh, Vamos a poder, yo les di la libertad a los expositores de hablar o en inglés o en español. Es una cuestión rara en donde tal vez inglés sea más inclusivo que el español porque tenemos audiencia internacional. So I will switch to English now, if that's okay. We'll try to be all of us as clear as possible. Um, my my first move then it will be to um, have a brief conversation, brief presentation with Diezo Zambrano, introducing as co-editors of this book, briefly what was the idea originally with the book, what we tried to capture, and then I will quickly open the floor for Onur and Nico Beckman, different order, and Diego and myself as also as chapter contributors to have a conversation between ourselves about what our chapters do in the larger framework of the book, and then have an exchange of two criteria, right, that I presented to them. One is how the argument that we present in those chapters and in the book has changed since the publication, and maybe looking forward to the future, what we see that argument prospectively towards the future. What can we see in Latin America in that particular area of expertise? So, Diego, would you like to share your thoughts about the general project, maybe how the book started, a little bit of the trajectory of how we got to the book, so we can get the conversation going?
Of course, yes. So thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I remember three main areas of conversations that you and I used to have while doing our PhD. Obviously, Latin American IR. It's the region that connects us beyond our academic interests. We're both from Latin America, and our shared frustrations on how the discipline explains or understands or studies the region, right? How certain things are just assumed. It's just because we're Latin Americans, right? The idea of passions or culture, the word culture thrown around just very openly to signify anything. Second, the idea of mainstream theory, the tension between mainstream theory and what we consider to be a peripheral region in international relations, which was Latin America. And third, how could we approach understanding agency? For me in particular, the question of agency has been at the intersection of structural theories in IR and pretty much everything else. And the early conversations we used to have, we were highly influenced by Arnold Wolfers, the idea of how do we explain those cases that mainstream theory, that structural theories simply don't seem to give us the answer. And that's how we landed on the concept of strategic culture. Pretty much the concept allowed us to have a structured way to see agency, to understand actor behavior in a systematic way. And we used to debate a lot on one of the ideas that we introduced in the introduction, the ladder of generality, right? This notion of, do we talk about only states, or do we see shared histories, geography, commonalities that can allow us to talk in more regional terms? And that's why the concept of strategic culture is so important for us, because it gave us the boundaries, the contours to understand independent agents and actors, but also from a regional level. By applying the same concept to these cases, we could go regionally rather than just in terms of the countries.
Right. So yeah, let me add to that. So the concept to non-specialists could sound or could probably sound a little bit contradictory or non-clear, right? The idea of strategic culture. How can you have a culture that is strategic? And it's a very particular term that was developed in the late 70s in the context of the Cold War in the United States. It's a way to understand the Soviet behavior, right? And everything that culturally the US associated to being Soviet. But then it was picked up and it was used in international relations more broadly to explain deviant behaviors of countries that didn't fit to certain expected patterns of behavior. And then it became an explanation of foreign policies that maybe led to mistakes, like big mistakes or blunders. And then you found the strategic culture concept allowed analysts to explain away, in a way, those cases by pointing out personality of leader problems, domestic issues in terms of an accountability of the leaders. They were not democratic enough, or they have no accountability, and so on. And then it became a very common concept and very commonly used in international relations, like Diego was explaining, to talk about this deviant type of behaviors that don't converge into pressures from the system, right? Contextual pressures. We expect weaker countries, for example, not to initiate war, right? Or smaller countries or weaker countries in a certain agenda, economic or otherwise, not to be pioneers or be investing or trying to be counterintuitively doing things that we can consider against the incentives of the context. But what we try to do in the book is, like Diego said, using sort of old and forgotten thinkers in IR, make of the concept something more systematic, more clear, in helping us understand not deviations necessarily, but also continuity of behavior by different actors in conditions where the incentives of the system don't point that way, right? So, and Onur, maybe because his contribution in the chapter is focused on the theoretical component, maybe Onur, can you give us a little more of an understanding of how in the book we basically work with the concept and which new levels we add, new angles of research that we add there?
Yeah, I'll just pick right up from there then. Honestly, probably the thing to really emphasize here is that, like, one of the problems in strategic cultural research that we found is that there is a tendency to attach too much meaning to culture, right? Culture with a capital C. And the original insight of strategic culture is about complementing the material, picking off where rationality and the material is not enough. And so our way of, looking at strategic culture, right, we want to revive, right, resuscitate this original idea of strategy. And the key idea there is that we had to come up with a very specific way of, maybe very consistent with the original concept of strategy itself as well. For us, strategy, and by extension, strategic culture, is something that involves a process, right? It's a process that features a conflict, a dialectic of wills, right? A conflict between two wills in a competitive setting. And from that definition, we actually were able to sort of extend the original sort of application of strategic culture from topics like, for example, nuclear security, military affairs, and great power politics. We actually, found the insight, right? Discovered the idea that, perhaps we can apply this idea to a variety of different domains of statecraft. So domains of statecraft refers to a lot of different competitive realms. Could be about economics. In Diego's case, for example, developmental strategies. In Dr. Beckman's case, it's about, for example, approach to drugs-related policies. In Dr. Terradas's approach, it's about diplomatic culture. So these are all different areas that are amenable to the logic of strategic statecraft. And of course, once you are able to expand on these domains, right, because each of these domains constitute, right, they're made up of tightly knit strategic communities, you can actually begin to discern some habits, some patterns. And that's where we sort of were able to expand the usage of it, right? We can look for continuities on one hand. At the same time, we also have a framework with which we can explain changes too. And of course, one of the most important things to note here is that once you expand the logic of strategy to these different domains, and once you understand that you can identify a variety of different strategic cultural communities, then it's no longer just about the strategic culture of the US or the nuclear decision makers in the Soviet Union, but it can apply to non-state actors. It can apply to minor powers. It can even be applied to multilateral and otherwise, international agencies as well. So those are just some of the ideas that we, introduce in the book.
Nice.
I
want to give time to Nico as well. He's been very patient. But before we go to you, Nico, just one clarification, because probably will help you with your contribution as well. Like, so basically, the point we arrive at in the conversation is that strategic culture has a strategic and a cultural component, right? And what we've seen is that in the literature in IR, the strategic, with the end of the Cold War, was downplayed, and what was empowered and invigorated and analyzed in depth was the cultural component, right? And that what we intervene with our book is in rebalancing that that distribution between strategy and culture. And this culture that Onur was talking is a lowercase c, right? This one point before we go to you, Nico. So the idea is that usually in cultural approaches, quote unquote, cultural approaches in international relations, the tendency is to overgeneralize characteristics of a country. So that country is warlike, or that country is a pacifist country, or that country is underdeveloped, or is a capitalist, imperialist power. And so we tend to overemphasize linguistic, religious, cultural aspects. And that's exactly the opposite of what the strategic culture concept originally tried to do. So the culture lowercase c that we are focusing on is the ways and habits of certain individuals in positions of power of decision making. And the inside of the strategic culture concept is that while a country, let's say Peru or Argentina or Brazil or Colombia, may have certain traditions of foreign policy, those traditions or those ways of doing things internationally, and therefore instilling a behavior into that country in foreign affairs, for example, may not correspond to larger trends or cultural aspects of the country. So you may have a small country that is weak militarily, but let's say may have a clique, a group of people that take power, take control, or take maybe just control of the foreign ministry. And then in that agenda that they control, be that domain that Onur was saying, be economic agenda, diplomatic agenda, the agenda that Nico will talk about, maybe drug policies and other things, or peacekeeping, as one of the contributions does in the book, they may instill in that component of the behavior of that state, that country, a certain particular continuity, right, in policy, despite changes in government or changes in the context. So that's the puzzle. That's the continuity, discontinuity kind of puzzling behavior that we're trying to to explain or to give a concept to give some answers. So, Nico, I will give you now your deserved 10 minutes after we all talked over you to give us. This will be a good example of a really good application, I think, in the book of these kind of conceptual refinements to a case study of a particular domain in Latin America. So, Nico, you have the microphone now.
Great, thanks so much, Tocayo. And yeah, I'm really happy we're doing this talk, especially organized by PUC, because if I remember correctly, it was at PUC that we presented for the first time about strategic culture at the LASA conference in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it's really great. Thinking about all the time that has passed and everything that has happened in between, and of course the great memories of our visit to Lima in 2016. So I will try to move a little bit away from the theoretical argument and moving more to the empirical side. And a question that I've been dealing with during my PhD degree, during my doctoral studies, and I'm still grappling with, is why governments in Latin America are sticking to failed policies. Right? In my case, it's drug policies, but it's a puzzle that, you know, I think could be applied to many other areas as well, like economic policy, maybe security. Very briefly, the majority of the governments in the region are sticking to a prohibitionist model that is trying to penalize and prohibit any kind of activity that either facilitates drug production or drug consumption. We know very well that these policies are not working because the illicit drugs industry is very vibrant. We have more consumption than ever before. And on top of that, we also have a lot of negative side effects like overpopulated prisons, the violence associated with the drug trade, the economic power of criminal groups that then corrupt governments and so on and so forth. So it's really a policy where all experts on the topic that have, you know, dedicated time and effort to understand it say, okay, this is not working. And there are certain alternatives that I also discuss in the chapter. My preferred approach is called harm reduction, which is an approach that recognizes that we're not going to extinguish drug consumption and somehow we have to deal with it. Right. And that can be done in different ways, either flexibly, like showing certain flexibility to legalize or regulate certain drugs, not necessarily all of them. So it's, you know, in between prohibition and legalization, which would say, no, we should just legalize all drugs, right? This is not my preferred approach, but these are sort of the alternatives. And the evidence in favor of harm reduction is quite strong. This seems to be an approach that has worked well for Uruguay. It has worked well for a couple of European countries like Portugal, Czech Republic, but still our region is sticking to a failed policy model. So my first argument, or the first thing I do in my chapter is to try to understand how this came up. And in relation to the concept of strategic culture, what I'm trying to show is that over several decades, the region cultivated a strategic culture based on prohibition. The literature about drug policy tends to prioritize the agency of the United States in that process. In some of my other works, I try to argue that Latin America also participated happily in the construction of the strategic culture. But that's another argument, right? So over time, when the US declared the war on drugs and many countries from Latin America joined the war on drugs, either because they were pressured or because they really liked this approach, you sort of establish or cultivate a strategic culture where bureaucrats, politicians, people from the judiciary sort of are being socialized into one approach, into a prohibitionist approach of dealing with drugs. So as I said, this policy model, the strategic culture, has had many problems. And in the first decade after the millennium, actually more famous, more renowned policy leaders came out and spoke against this approach. There were a bunch of ex-presidents like Cesar Gaviria from Colombia, Fernando Henrique Cardoso from Brazil, Ernesto Zedillo from Mexico, and that said, no, we were in power, we applied these policies, and we know that these policies are not working. So what these leaders did is sort of change the discourse, change the way in which we talk about drugs, and this opened up new ways for experimental approaches, right? And then there were other actors that sort of, went ahead, politicians, policy leaders that said, okay, we need to change the approach. And for a brief while in Latin America, it appeared like countries were actually changing their policies. There were a lot of flexibilizations about, for example, what to do with drug users, not to put them in jail anymore. Uruguay was clearly a leader by promoting the legalization not only of medical marijuana, but also recreational marijuana. Nevertheless, briefly afterwards, countries sort of slided back. In Ecuador, even under the same president, Rafael Correa, in the first term, he was an advocate of a more liberal approach towards drug policy. And in the second term, he sort of brought the country back to a very prohibitionist, heavy-handed, punitive approach on dealing with drugs. So the puzzle I was trying to explain is why. So I'm using the concept of strategic culture to show that actors that were socialized in the strategic culture of prohibition actually came out and defended this approach in public policy debates, in the implementation, in a lot of different ways, exerting pressure on governments, right, using their political capital, using their power in order to prevent that a more flexible, a more progressive, a different type of drug policy could take hold in different countries. So my case studies were Ecuador, Argentina, and actually Peru as well. In Peru, for a short time, we had a drug czar, head of the VIDA, the national government agency on drugs, that tried to implement a new approach about cultivating illegal coca, right? He said that we shouldn't eradicate anymore because it doesn't work. It just creates problems for the peasants and their communities. And he actually had the support of Ollanta Humala for a brief period, but then very rapidly representatives of the strategic culture of the traditional approach came out and sidelined him, and he had to leave the government actually within months. And we had similar dynamics in Argentina. We had similar dynamics in Ecuador. There can be other cases as well, Colombia too, where it very neatly changed between one government and another, right? Santos being a little bit more liberal and flexible, then Duque bringing back prohibition, and now we have Gustavo Petro, who's trying very hard also to implement a new approach, but it's not that easy, and he's sort of facing the same problems. So I'm about to finish, but getting back to the theory side, so a way in which my chapter maybe is a little bit different is to show that the agents, the representatives of a strategic culture, not only influence the implementation side, but they really use their political capital to exert political pressure, right? Like in a game of politics where you have different actors with different interests, and each one is pushing against each other, and then the majority in most countries, right? So it's not necessarily an argument about how culture as such affects decision making, but it's more an argument about how culture affects the interests of key policy players that then use their pressure and their political power and capital in order to influence outcomes. So yeah, that would be my main contribution. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much.
Perfect, Nico. And thank you for reminding us. Yeah, the project started here at Book, I remember 2017 on the building we are now in political science and social science. It was not even, the hall was not even done in the ground, to put it. But I remember we were here. Thank you also for that really clear presentation and weaving of how the concept can help you elucidate this type of cases, right? This type of policies that otherwise will be puzzling, or could be seen as contradictory, or could be explained away by something else. And I appreciate that, returning to the concept right at the end, that this is like microculture. It's a culture of a particular group of people, not culture in the large sense, right? And another case, I think, another case study that we have in the book that, apart from yours, it's like the poster child, like the best application, I think, for this is Diego, right? Because I do more traditional diplomatic case study. Felix Martin, who apologized, he had like a computer issue, couldn't join us, also looks into the military. And then Nicole Jenne from La Universidad de Santiago de Chile, also German. She also looks at the security issues like peacekeeping. So, but apart from those security realm, differently defined, I think Diego and Nico, they have chapters that that really elucidate the applicability beyond the traditional interstate war peace kind of scenario. So Diego, I'll give you some minutes also for you to do like Nico just did, like help us understand how even in the world of political economy in Latin America, this concept will help us understand this otherwise contradictory behavior of insisting on policies that are either failed or keep failing, or historically we know that the assessment is wrong, but we keep, what explains that we keep insisting on them. So you have the microphone now.
Thank you. So for me, the main preoccupation in understanding Latin America political economy is the feeling, the sensation that we are constantly in the same cycle, a cycle in which there is an expansion of the export economy of primary products, of commodities, in which there seems to be an amazing moment for Latin America, and the region captures the imagination of publications all around the world. And suddenly there is a dramatic change in the global economy. And once again, we see socioeconomic problems arise in the region, whether it is inflation, poverty, or inequality. One of the characteristics that caught my imagination very early in my academic years was to realize that in Latin America, I think that when it comes to thinking about regimes in power, we have tried a wide variety. We've had military dictatorships that are affiliated either with the left or the right. We'd have military dictatorships that are either a group or a junta in power. We'd have military dictatorships that are centered around the cult of personality. We had moments of democratic regimes, successive democratic regimes that have either been identified with a more center-right approach or with a more radical leftist approach. And yet still, there are certain immutable facts of political economy in Latin America. One of those at the center of it, that all academics that study the region point towards as a main culprit, the ill-famous extractivism. This notion of centering our productive activities around the extraction, mobilization towards support, and then commercialization of primary products into the world economy. In fact, and this is a work that continues in my dissertation, I argue that the reason that the Latin American state is able to solidify, it's because it arranges itself around these productive activities. So how is it that we have different regimes? In fact, by the late 90s and early 2000s, we have the so-called pink tide of leftist reformist governments that come to power, denouncing the hyper dependence on the exploitation of primary products that characterized the region in the 90s, and all the liberal policies that came with the Washington Consensus. And when these movements reach power, it's not like they all of a sudden work towards transforming the structure of the productive capacity of Latin America. On the contrary, they basically move towards extractivism as well, on riding the wave of Chinese industrialization. What explains that? To me, that made absolutely no sense. So that's when the concept of strategic culture came to my avail. I work in the dependency theory literature. I am very fond of the dependency literature, but at some point the dependency literature loses me. And it is when certain authors, while diagnosing a reality acutely, they fall victim to the observation that Latin America is just an inanimate region with an incapacity to do anything about its role in the global economy. I philosophically rebel against that position for several reasons. Primarily because we have been, even with the influence of the structure and great power politics, we have been an independent region for over 200 years. Second, because I do identify that there have been moments of opportunities for change for Latin American countries to try something different, to move towards different productive processes or movements, and they have failed to do it. Or because, and this was my conclusion, because I think that the region is part of, it's the main actor in perpetuating extractivism in the continent. It's because actors that reach the state understand that, as I said earlier, the state has been centered around the extraction of primary products, that it is its capacity to govern comes primarily from it, and because from its inception, for whatever contradictory it might seem, leaders in the region understood that that was Latin America's role in the global economy. Even in the moments in which we, as a region, tried to move away from it in establishing import substitution industrialization, what we have is an experience in which we were able to create intermediary industrial processes and products, but most of that was built around the capacity of governments to get foreign currencies and capital from the commercialization of commodities. So I identified three main areas in the formation of the Latin American state and in the formation of the political economy of the region that explain what I came to call the strategic culture of political economy in Latin America. The first one was at the inception of our nations, when we become independent. All of our elites shared an education and a culture in favor of the traditional liberal model for growth for the independent nations. They not only shared the dogma, but understood that in focusing in this dogma, in the consolidation of certain extractive activities, they were able to ultimately pacify the region, define borders, and create a status quo, a coalition for power around the state that could dominate, that could govern, more or less. Obviously, there are differences within the region and different activities in different areas of the continent. For this argument, the work of Fernando Enrique Cardoso and Enzo Faleto was crucial in identifying how those elites consolidated. The second one was also a very cultural phenomenon in the region, which was that in terms of consumption, Latin Americans tend to favor imported goods. Elites do the same. The work of, I'm forgetting the author right now, but the title is The Allure of the Foreign. I recommend that book to anyone that is interested in consumption in Latin America. It explains how from the very early moments of the post-colonial era, elites in Latin America preferred to consume manufactured imported goods. They even had a normative judgment, a positive normative judgment of foreign manufactured goods over any local product. And then the third element that I identify in the chapter that has worked towards forming this strategic culture of political economy in Latin America is the the emergence in the collective's imagination of the role of the all-powerful Latin American state in providing or alleviating for the social maladies that plague the region, primarily poverty and inequality. And so it is with those three ingredients that we find the Latin American state constantly trapped in this contradiction of expanding and contracting itself in order to manage the exploitation of natural resources, and therefore use different types of policies, whether it is trying to stabilize macroeconomic indicators, or trying to control inflation, or trying direct conditional cash transfers, or trying public employment, or trying to focus on targeting the reduction of poverty or incentivizing growth, and constantly repeating the same recipe, which is to do everything around the resources that come from the commercialization of commodities. At the center of all of the way that the continent satisfies its material needs, it's extractivism, and extractivism is what I call the source, the main characteristic or label of the extractivist strategic culture of political economy in Latin America.
Thank you, Diego, and Nico. So we have, since we started 5 minutes past 10 here in Lima, we were promised, okay, we're gonna have the 60 minutes, so we still have 15 minutes to go. So what I would invite people to do, we have more people here in Zoom than on Facebook, but to at least the ones on Zoom, if you have questions, if you have questions in particular to some of us or in general, feel free to post them in the chat, and we will try to honor them and answer them as they come along. In the meantime, while you think about the questions or you formulate the questions, what do you think, guys, if we move on to something we don't do in the book, which is, let's have a conversation about, since its inception, which is from 2017 on, and then a book finally last year. And then it becomes frozen in time, right? What is written is static, right? But then we keep reading, we keep living, we keep moving around in the world, we keep seeing things. So Nico already kind of alluded to some of that. Where is his research going? But let's think about how is what we wrote and the implications of what we wrote. How do we see that moving along? I know, Diego, you're going to be pessimistic. You're going to be like, nothing has changed. But let's reflect, maybe like think out loud a bit. Onur, you probably think about Turkey, right? Onur is working outside of the book context, but he's working also applying this to Turkey, has a project on that. So I'll give you times, maybe Onur, since people waiting for a while, and then we go back to Nico and Diego.
I mean, obviously, I'm a bit of outsider here, a bit of more of a neophyte. My expertise is not in Latin America. I took some courses. I studied in FIU, and I obviously met this extraordinary group of people. But beyond that, unfortunately, it's not very scholarly, my knowledge of it. But it is, I think, an important study. And, strategic culture is overall an interesting idea. I see a lot of people talking about it. I see a lot of people talking about strategic culture here in Turkey as well. But unfortunately, much of that conversation is exactly like what Nico described, this whole kitchen sink approach, right? This kitchen sink approach in which there is this, I suppose, determinism, right? Determinism based off of history and geography. Oh, the mountains run parallel to the sea, and because of that, Turkey has a such and such grand strategy because of this strategic culture. I mean, usually we see that kind of analysis. And what I'd actually like to do is, since I worked on the worked on trying to produce the one of the main theoretical chapters of this book, is to actually apply that logic to my own country context as well. It's something that I'd like to do. And I think it's also important because if you're operating also from a global south context, this is an idea that I didn't develop nearly enough in my own chapter, but a little bit later on in the conclusion. We talked a little bit about this, which is, of course, expanding on this global IR theme, right? How strategic culture can be an avenue with which to develop homegrown theories and homegrown approaches about, let's say, decision making, about state behavior. I think that's a very promising area, and I think that's something that you know, a lot of scholars around the world can benefit from, especially because we're trying to pluralize and democratize the discipline as well. That's definitely a common point in which we can all have a conversation about. Anyway, I don't want to, you know, take too much of your time with this, but these are, I think, worthwhile areas to explore in the future.
Nice. Nico, you want to add something to what you already pointed out?
Yeah, so in my case, I think there are good reasons both to be pessimistic and to be optimistic. Because when there was this push in the region, right, to look for alternatives, to try new things, to do models, I mean, this has clearly come to a halt. And one of the reasons is strategic culture, right? There have been lots of actors socialized in the prohibitionist model, and they came out and did their bit, like, to hold this trend. And on the other hand, there's also public opinion, right? And in the majority of our countries, public opinion, right, tends to be in favor of heavy-handed, punitive policy models. So there are really a lot of restrictions for different policies to happen. On the other hand, if we compare the situation with the 1980s and 1990s and the first years of the 2000s, prohibition really was the only game in town. There was no alternative. There was no way a country could just say, okay, I'm going to legalize marijuana or try something new, because both the domestic and the international pressures were so strong that basically countries from the region had no agency or no autonomy in the drug policy field. Nowadays, we have a situation in which prohibitionist actors have the majority, but there is a legitimate opposition. And the opposition takes part in the discussion, and they resonate with some political parties. So we have a more open debate, right? And that's a good thing. That's how it should be in a democracy, right? We cannot always hope and expect that our preferred choices are the ones that the governments will do, but at least these options are on the table, right? And yeah, like my moderate hope is that there will be certain windows of opportunities where intelligent actors will be able to push for these policy models. And Uruguay has been one of the cases with the Mujica government. There were specific circumstances that have enabled actors in favor of this approach to put it on the agenda. And this can happen again in other countries. And Uruguay has not had a bad experience with marijuana legalization, right? Just to give one example. So I think there is a certain potential for new policies, for more flexible policies to take hold, but in a very restrictive context. So yeah, these are my
nice.
My two reflections about the issue.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, I like that. I don't know if the other people see it too, but I see the connectivity, right, between how experience in one country, you mentioned Uruguay, could have also repercussions in opening the agenda in other places, right? That's also something that Onur mentioned at the beginning. It's something we also try to do. We add this regional level, this socialization process, right? The traditional strategic culture approaches just look at countries individually, right? And then disregard this regional level of analysis that Diego does so well, right? Also understanding a pattern that all these countries in Latin America we have, regardless of the governments being military of this or that sort, or leftist or centrist or far rightist. there's certain policies that continue, and they're part of it structural, but big component is who is in power, what is in their minds, what is their ways of doing things. So let me connect both my question for this section and my own paper. I'm not going to present my chapter, but my chapter, and it's very well connected to what Felix Martin, who is not here today for technical issues, which is related to, in his case, the military establishment. How people in the structures of power of the military, they can come with certain education, certain strategic understandings of situations, and when they control the agenda for military things, they can instill in a country, in that particular area, that particular domain, a certain continuity, regardless of whether the end of the Cold War happened or not. In my case, I look at the same kind of analysis, but in the diplomatic realm, in the chancelleries of Latin America. And I also apply this to unlock a kind of a puzzle in the region of how to understand that the region moved from the independence period and the wars in the late 19th century to what seems like suddenly to a 20th century of peace after the Chaco War. So in the literature, they're called the long peace in Latin America, this phenomenon. But the theories in international relations that deal with peace have not been able to fully grasp, fully explain, or convincingly, let's say, explain our case, our regional case. And the main puzzle is that we became a region of no war and peace right when we transitioned to the most brutal dictatorships from the 1930s onwards. And the democracies were, far and in between and very weak. And then when connecting this to my prompt for this section, right? The continuity of these arguments, right? One of my agendas I'm trying to work on for the future, for a paper, but maybe a book later on, is to think about the end of the dictatorial period in Argentina, in Mexico, Brazil, Chile, right? Chile, the later one in the 90s. But when the dictatorships are over and democracies take hold again in the region, we inherit from this darker period of no democracies this interstate peace between states. But then the region is also famously or infamously known for being the most violent region in the world. Here, interpersonally, and in the lower level of analysis, not between states, but within states, and even transnationally, even more by the day, we are one of the most violent regions in the world. Their statistics show that we are number one in violent crimes with small arms and gender violence and all kinds of interpersonal, and of course gun-related narco trafficking is one of the leading phenomena in this trend. So my research now, I'm trying to look to the future, applying this concept, how this inherited situation, systemic context of peace plays out in a context of domestic democratic governments, largely. Venezuela and other cases are more debatable how democratic in the liberal sense they are. But this is an interesting puzzle for maybe like a bis, not like a continuation of my original paper, which looks into the 19th century and early 20th century. But this is something interesting for other people also to investigate. How and why in this current decade, we are beginning to talk about, is the Essequibo region in danger? Is Venezuela going to use force against neighbors? During the Trump administration, we were talking about if the U.S. was going to intervene in Venezuela. We have a lot of tensions coming back. And even in international media, the coverage is back that the situation in Latin America is deteriorating and interstate relations may deteriorate as well. And then the puzzle will be how can I explain this deterioration of interstate relations when we are all democracies. But in the past, we have a very stable interstate peace. except Argentina, Chile in the 70s, but with dictatorships in power. So that's also, I mean, I don't have the questions now. Sorry, I don't have the answers now. I have the questions, but not the answers now. But that's, for me, it's like an interesting like agenda branching out for the future. And also it connects a little bit with what Nico was saying about drug policies, and if the region or not becoming a little bit more progressive in certain policies or not, and how that coincides, the domestic with the international, right, with the regional. I see we have 1 more minute. I see one comment. It says, does the lithium demand fewer fiber coming from technology? I don't know if fiber was a typo. Coming from technology manufacturers modifies in any way Latin American industrial policy based on primary resource export. This is for Diego, I think. How does these critical minerals could represent a new point of departure to think about change in Latin American geopolitical dynamics? Or does they represent the same old BAU backward resources countries pattern that Diego is? Okay, Diego, we have like 1 minute. That's a very complex question, but basically what I get from this is about the new resources, the new minerals for new technologies, and you have the last word.
So very quickly, the extraction of primary products per se is not something that Latin America should shy away from. The problem is its centrality in how society is organized. So if I'm not gonna, for lack of a better term, if all we do productively is the extraction of these products and we just sell them, we are, as a region, constantly dependent on how they are commercialized, and how they are commercialized responds to cycles that are in no way part of the Latin American pathway. As you just say, now there is a fever, technological fever, that is driven by the development of new technologies in other industrial areas of the world. So it is not dissimilar to what has happened with other products in the past. But at the center of the problem is the organization of the continent. It's the strategic culture of using this type of productive activity to solve for all our socio-economic needs.
Well, I think we did very well on time. We adjusted to changes. We have two speakers that had issues, but I think we adjusted well. We were right on time, maybe 1 minute late. I will want to thank you, Nico, Onur, Diego, and we were going to do this again in hopefully in person in Miami soon, before the end of the year. Also for the public, this will also become, we're trying to create like a forum in a journal, small pieces, small versions of our arguments with this reflection about the future and about the how our particular contributions traveled in time and the consequences of our analysis. So more will be done on this, and you will be invited to participate if you want virtually on those other events, hopefully with the other cast, the rest of the contributors of the chapters. Thank you, everyone. Have a good morning, and we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Nico. Bye.